Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the Libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. I'm joined as I am every week by my co-host Richard Ebeing, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. If this is your first exposure to the Future of Freedom Foundation, I would invite you to come and visit our website at fff.org, where we have 30 years worth of articles, videos, and presentations, all of which present the principled case for the libertarian philosophy. All right, Richard, next segment in our series on socialism. We've talked about what socialism is in a general context and the ideal concept in accordance with how socialists believe, and we looked at some of the practical ramifications. And we were getting ready last time to look at the transition toward a socialist society in America, specifically with the progressive movement that would ultimately culminate in the New Deal. And we even talked about some of the comparisons of the New Deal in the last segment to the principles of socialism and economic fascism. But it occurred to me that maybe we ought to first discuss the founding principles of the United States. Because when we talk about transitioning to a socialist interventionist system, that obviously implies that it's transitioning from something. And I think we need to discuss what that something was. And so let me start out with my perspective on the founding principles of the United States, and then you can take it from there. That if we go back to, let's say, 1776, we have two remarkable events taking place. The publication of the Declaration of Independence, which talks about natural God-given rights with which every person is endowed, not just American citizens, that these are rights that pre-exist government. Revolutionary declaration. I mean, even today it's revolutionary because a lot of people think that rights come from government or from the Constitution or other such things. Well, Jefferson's saying no. It's the purpose of government to protect the exercise of these rights. They pre-exist government. And then there was the publication of the remarkable book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, a Scottish philosopher, which was really just as revolutionary as the Declaration of Independence. Because as you know, for centuries before, governments had regulated economic activity, controlled, managed economic activity, plundered and looted people, anti-speculation laws, anti-profiteering laws, all with this notion that government needed to protect the poor from the vicissitudes of life and from rapacious businessmen. Smith comes along and has this revolutionary notion that says, oh, no. That is why people are so poor, because government's been trying to take care of people by managing economic activity. That really, if you want higher standards of living, separate economy and the state, get government out of regulated economic activity, and that gives rise to the term free enterprise. Make enterprise free of government control and management. Well, by the time the Constitution calls the federal government into existence, it didn't bring into existence that 100% libertarian society. I mean, there are massive exceptions like slavery. Obviously, for a large segment of Americans, they didn't experience any kind of freedom at all. And then there were other exceptions: terrorists, protective terrorists, or land grants to the railroads, crony capitalism, partnerships between government and business. Notwithstanding the exceptions, though, there was one segment of Americans, which was a fairly large segment, that experienced what really can only be described as the closest to a libertarian or free market or capitalist sense properly understood that we can ever imagine. I mean, here were the principles to consider that for a large segment of Americans. No income tax, you kept everything you earned. No welfare state, no mandatory charity, no Social Security, no Medicare, farm subsidies, corporate bailouts. Everybody kept his own money and decided for himself what to do with it. So all charity was necessarily voluntary. I mean, that's how the museums and the opera houses and the libraries got built, because people were becoming wealthy and giving it to charity. No immigration controls. people were free to come from all over the world, especially the poor who were flooding in to take advantage of this new free enterprise system. Virtually no economic regulations, a few maybe at the state and local level, but certainly virtually none at the federal level, or very few. No public schooling systems. There were no gun control laws, no drug laws, no drug war, no Federal Reserve. They had sound money, gold coins and silver coins. And the result of this was just the most, despite what students are taught about the Industrial Revolution, was the greatest increase in the standard of living ever. I mean, people were flooding into America to get wealthy, to participate in this, and many did. Many went from rags to riches in 1, 2, or 3 generations. So it was a remarkable society. There was also a lot of voluntary charity taking place. So that sets the framework. I mean, that's a different society than one that has ever existed, especially compared to today's America. And that's what the transition was taking place from, that particular society. So I'll turn it over to you now and get your perspectives on what was going on here.
Well, I think that what you present, like a template of the ideas, so I can sort of amplify and add to a little bit. The degree to which the individual was a slave to his born circumstances cannot be underplayed or overplayed. In Europe, they had the feudal system. There were lords of the manors. People were born to and bound to the land. The profession or occupation of your father and your grandfather is the one that you were tied to. Liberties, as we come to take them for granted today, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of worship, these were all things that either did not exist or only in the most abridged forms in Europe before America. You looked the wrong way at a lord of the manor, and it could result in you being imprisoned or having your ears cut off or your tongue cut out for having said something that offended your better who was in the castle on the hill and to whom you were bound through all of your life. And suddenly this new land opens based upon an emerging new philosophy of individual freedom, captured in the writings of people like John Locke with his 2 treatises on government, in which he articulates and solidifies this emerging idea that individuals have an inherent right to their own life, their own liberty, and their own honestly acquired property. And that, as you were saying, government does not give you your rights, it does not give them as a sort of a privilege to be bestowed and taken away, but each individual has these rights inherently as a human being, from God or justifiable and provable through reason, that government has as its purpose the securing and the protecting and not the abridging. And as you said, slowly but surely, as the 19th century, first after the 18th century, but certainly with the 19th century, with improvements in oceanic transportation, first hundreds of thousands and then millions of people come from first Europe and then other parts of the world to the United States. At home, they had suffered political oppression, religious persecution, a closing off of economic opportunities because of privileges and favors for those close to the king or through hereditary rights of land and occupation. And they fled into this country because there were no immigration barriers, whether you be rich or poor, whether you be Catholic or Protestant or Jewish or nothing. You could pay your fare by ship across the Atlantic, land in one of the major ports of that time, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, where I am, and you basically were free to enter the country and to pursue your dreams. Government taxed hardly anything. Government regulations were few and far between. There were some regulations, Jacob, and that can't be denied. For example, in the city of Baltimore, you would be fined $1 if you flew a kite or played ball on Sunday when you were supposed to be at church. Yes, you would be charged and fined by the city government $1 for flying a kite. So that was obviously an abridgment of human liberty. But that shows the extent at which government did not extend into our affairs. The continent was settled. Out of the wilderness rose towns, villages, cities, industries, because people kept wealth they had created literally with their bare hands from this virgin soil. Now, it must be pointed out, and it cannot be denied, that not everyone had these opportunities. There were, in the first half of the 19th century, several millions of residents here who had not come of their own free will. These were Africans that had been brought in slave ships across the ocean. They were sold on auction blocks in southern areas of the United States, including the city I'm in Charleston. One can go still see here as a museum the slave locations where people would be bought and sold. They were held in bondage. They were held in ignorance. When you died, you were put into unnamed graves. So even your own family members could not pay tribute or homage to you by turning that grave, because you can be sure who is buried where. And any slave who attempted to escape from bondage was threatened with recapture and punishment. And the federal government, under the Dred Scott decision, endorsed that responsibility of threat of imprisonment and fining if you failed to return a runaway slave to his master south of the Mason-Dixon line. And that cannot be denied and not downplayed. America was a land of liberty, but not for a minority who is here. And it took a long time for Americans to challenge this presumption in the country. Some were anti-slave because they believed all men were equal and equal children in the eyes of God, and it was an abomination to hold them as slaves. But the fact is, even where there were free blacks in the northern states before the Civil War, there was a high degree of discrimination. When Frederick Douglass, the famous orator who was himself an escaped slave from Virginia or Maryland, when he escaped and then tried to make a living in Connecticut, he was hounded out of places that a black man should presume to compete in a trade with white men. So I mean America was a country with an ideal that was partly practiced, but had horrendous contradictions and inconsistencies in actually how the society operated, and that needs to be emphasized. America was not a land of the free for all from the start. But I want to emphasize something. You know, it says that two objects cannot occupy the same physical space at the same time. Neither can two contradictory ideas permanently exist in the mind of an individual, the minds of many people, and in the culture of a society. And America had a conflict that it had to solve. And that is, do we believe in the principles that are espoused in that Declaration of Independence to justify the freedom of the country from British rule? That we hold that all men are created equal, that they are endowed, all of them, with rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that government is meant to secure these and not abridge it. And not all men were given that freedom. And it took a long time for every American over several generations to come to terms with, do I believe in these principles, or do I practice a lie in saying that it only applies to some and not all? A terrible civil war finally brought that to an end. 600,000 lives were lost, and part of the country was devastated. But that was the inconsistency, and there are elements that we're still overcoming from that. But what's important is that the ideals in the Declaration of Independence, the spirit of individualism, of self-responsibility, of the right of pursuing your own hopes and dreams, required, obligated, guided, demanded that eventually the inconsistency of slavery had to be set aside, or the country would itself have to give up the principles upon which it was founded. And we came to move closer to that ideal. But as you were saying, for multitudes of millions of people, they came here as free citizens, free residents, keeping their what they earned, pursuing the professions and occupations of their choice, living their lives as they wanted, not restricted by regulations and control, and to the extent that prejudice and bigotry existed, separate from the slavery issue. These were not state-sponsored bigotries and prejudices. An individual person can say, I don't want to deal with this Irishman. I don't want to deal with this Jew. But he could not turn to the state, as in other countries around the world, and use the power of coercion to compel everyone in the society to share his prejudices in their conduct towards others, which meant there could be private prejudice, but not state prejudice, which meant even those who were not liked by everyone could still pursue their dreams because no one else was bound to follow that bigotry. And there was always going to be someone who cared about only one thing at the end of the day. How can this person enter into an association or a trade with me and improve my circumstances by my freely exchanging with them? And that was the great key to the ending of these, because the principle of the country was individualism, Jacob. You're not Irish, you're not Catholic, you're not Italian, you're not Polish, you're not German, you're not anything. In the eyes of the system and the ideal of the country, you are an individual to be judged on that basis and to associate with others in that form. And that was the great foundation upon which the country was formed, upon which it became wealthy. The beacon, as you were saying, that attracted multitudes of people suffering and poverty. That was the America, that was the dream of multitudes and made us the great country that was this ideal of the world. The problem is other ideas in the late 19th and then the 20th century have been undermining it.
Yeah, no, that's a great summation. And the other thing about the discrimination aspect of it is that while there were people who disliked the Irish or the Italians or whatever segment of immigrants that were coming in, there was no push to install immigration controls. So you still had this open immigration system that was taking place where Irish were coming in, Italians were coming in, despite the fact that there was a fairly large number of people that didn't like them. And here was the other thing about the market process that people were discovering, is that a lot of the people that were being discriminated against privately, where there was this private bigotry against Italians or Irish or whatever, they were doing very well economically in the marketplace. So that's what people were discovering, that in a marketplace, a free marketplace, free of government control and regulation, the bigot actually ends up paying a price in terms of lower profits, lower market share, and that you could come to America and you could make it even if you were a Jew, a Irishman, a WAP, a Italian, or whatever, the group that people were discriminating against. That was the beauty of the marketplace. And we actually witnessed this after the end of the Civil War. That people, one of the arguments that might have been made about slavery is, oh, you can't end it all at once. That would be cruel because blacks don't have a work ethic. They don't know how to start businesses. They don't know how to please customers and so forth. Well, once Lee surrenders to Grant, that's essentially it as far as the Civil War is over. People are free. There's a button that's pushed that says all slaves are now free. And they actually were doing very well economically. They were starting their businesses. If you look at some of these historically black colleges and universities, many of them were founded immediately after the end of the war, which indicates that blacks clearly understood the importance of education in a society. And so one of the reasons that Jim Crow laws began coming into effect in the late 1800s and so forth, early 1900s, was because blacks were outcompeting whites in many businesses. And so the whites needed the force of government to start locking blacks out of the labor market, like with occupational licensure laws and high regulatory barriers and so forth. Now the other thing,
Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow laws, exactly. Now I think we also should point out that women didn't have complete rights. There were voting restrictions on women, prohibiting them from voting. There was laws that entitle the husband to take total control over their assets and so forth. So that clearly was a deprivation of freedom. Another thing I think that's important to point out about the 19th century was, and the early founding of the government, was that the American people had a deep antipathy towards standing armies, what are called today the national security state or the military-industrial complex or the deep state. That there was a huge antipathy towards standing armies. Why? Well, because they understood that standing armies always posed the biggest threat to the freedom of the citizenry. The threat is never from the external threat that's the biggest. It's always the internal threat of the military. And as many of the founding fathers said, once the military takes control, how do you fight them, especially if the citizenry is disarmed? Which was one of the reasons why gun rights were so important to our American ancestors. Not just to protect against criminals, but to protect and deter against tyrants. And so there was no national security state. That form of governmental structure under which we live today came into existence post-World War II. That America was founded as a limited government republic, a totally different type of governmental structure. There was no Pentagon, no enormous standing army. There was a basic standing army, enough to quell Indian fights or even to engage in a war with Mexico, but certainly nothing of the size that exists today that has the power to go all over the world and establish military bases and embroil itself in conflicts all over the world. There was no CIA, there was no NSA, and there was a philosophy opposing foreign wars. And that foreign interventionism, that was the philosophy that was encapsulated in John Quincy Adams' famous speech on the 4th of July in 1821. It's called In Search of Monsters to Destroy, where he says, America, we know that there's bad things that happen around the world. Tyrants, civil wars, conflict, oppression, famines, but America's not going to send troops to go help people in foreign lands. That's not to say we won't do anything. We'll open up our borders to people that are want to flee tyranny or unable to flee tyranny or oppression or famines. You're free to come to the United States. This is one country that will not force you back to your country of origin. But that was a remarkable development because when you put it all together, Richard, you don't have massive government spending for either the welfare state or the warfare state. You don't have an income tax, so the government has very limited resources because it wasn't doing very much. It was a limited government republic, which meant very few powers. And so here you have this mountain of capital that is coming into existence through savings, because people were saving a large portion of their incomes. That savings goes into productive capital. Employers were then going out and borrowing that money from the banks, getting equipment and tools that were making workers more productive. That increased productivity inured to everybody in their roles as consumers, but also in higher wage rates. Not because employers were necessarily such good people, but because of competitive conditions. Other businesses were hiring workers, and most everybody was sharing in this bounty. People were getting wealthy, but the poor were reaching middle class levels in terms of standard of living. And that's how all the charity things got established. Hospitals and museums and libraries. It was a remarkable way of life. I mean, Americans really discovered the key to ending poverty. And so it's even more remarkable that Americans, later generations of Americans, end up abandoning that system.
Yes, the other thing here about the charity is that when Alexis de Tocqueville, the famous French political and social philosopher, returned from a long stay in the United States in the 1830s and wrote his famous book, Democracy in America, one of the things he highlights in a chapter in the book is the amazing observation on the degree of private association and forming of associations by Americans, whether it be religious affairs or proselytizing or community efforts that we now say involve, social safety nets of helping the poor, the indigent, hospitals, educational establishments. All of this was views that the social problems of society were not the duty or the responsibility or even to be trusted in the hands of the government. It fell upon free and responsible individuals to see that what the problems were and to attract their fellow citizens from their own communities, their own state, from other parts of the country, to form these associations of civil society, that is, outside the realm of government, to find the solutions and the answers to dealing with these matters of common interest to people in their respective larger or smaller communities. There was a vibrancy in it. And he, in fact, after discussing this, de Tocqueville says that this is one of the institutional phenomena of the United States that he felt that Europeans should pay most attention to, this ability of solving social problems without government involvement and the success of them. All of this was the way America operated. You did not presume as a default position that if there's a problem that you or other community members are facing, you automatically turn to the government. You turn to yourself and try to find ways with you and your neighbors to solve these in creative and effective and cost-efficient ways.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point because it dovetails perfectly in what Jefferson was talking about in the Declaration of Independence, that everybody's been endowed by nature and nature's God with certain fundamental rights. If we look at it in a religious sense, we would say that God trusted man with freedom. That he would say, here, you decide what to do with your life, with your money, with your values, and I'm going to let you make that decision. I'm going to free you to make that decision. Well, knowing that some people might choose wrongly. But that's the essence of freedom. If you're not free to choose wrongly, then you really can't be considered free. Now, there's a limit there. As we libertarians have often said, you're not free to go and violate somebody else's rights. You're not free to initiate force against somebody else. You're not free to murder, rape, steal, burglarize, and trespass, and so forth. But in the realm of peaceful activity, people are free to live their lives any way they want. And part of that is that people are going to choose wrongly. So if you take a young person, that let's say he gets to keep everything he earns, no withholding, no government taking any money out of his income, and then his parents get sick, it's very possible that that young person might say, I'm going to turn my back on my parents. I'm not going to help them. But that's the essence of freedom. That's what Jefferson's talking about when he talks about God-given rights or natural rights. The minute you cross over to the other side and you say, well, we're going to have to force that young person to do the right thing, you have destroyed freedom. And you've destroyed the opportunity of the person to make that choice for himself. So if a young person, let's say, is pulling in $30,000 a year, and you say, well, we're going to take $10,000 of that to help others, you have now deprived that young person of that opportunity to the extent of that $10,000 to decide for himself what to do with that money. And the natural way is, hey, sometimes it entails struggle. Should I use it for this purpose? Should I use it for that purpose? But it's in that struggle that one exercises conscience. And that exercises of conscience tends to raise people's standard of right conduct. It nudges people toward moral conduct rather than try to do a shortcut by turning over to the coercive apparatus of the state. And that's what I think produced all of the things you're talking about that de Tocqueville described in his book Democracy in America. When people were free and they were accumulating wealth, they engaged in all this voluntary activity. Not everyone. There were people that said, I'm going to hoard my wealth and I'm going to not share it with anybody. But to a large extent, people did. This was the first time in history where there were really people getting wealthy, including poor people, entering the middle class in large numbers. And what's interesting is they would save a portion of it, but there was also this outpouring of voluntary charity and voluntary activity, like you were pointing out, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time and energy, where people were devoting themselves to this effort or that effort or that effort. I think that's what real freedom is all about, Richard. I think that period, if you take like 1890, okay, there was crony capitalism, there was government business partnerships, land grants to the railroads, building of canals. But in terms of the dynamism of a market process, inventions taking place for a 20 or 30 year period. I just saw a documentary where the Kellogg brothers were fighting over the production of cereals. They had invented cereals. And then you had a guy named, I forget his first name, but Hershey, that came up with this remarkable formula for chocolate, where he was trying to seek his own self-interest. They were all trying to get rich. The Kellogg brothers, Post cereals, he was trying to get wealthy. But look how they benefited mankind, you know, the invention of the automobile. I mean, that was a very exciting time for America, but it was because there was a large extent of economic freedom during that time.
Yeah, it dovetails with the point that you made at the beginning of two momentous events of 1776. On the one hand, the American Declaration of Independence in July, but the other one you mentioned, and that was in March of 1776, the publication of Adam Smith's book on the Wealth of Nations, because the very essence of his analysis, the core element, was the demonstration that men left free and required to associate with each other on the basis of voluntary and mutually agreed upon trade and association creates the context and the incentives by which each individual pursuing his own self-interest can only successfully do so by assisting in the improvement of the conditions of his fellow men. If you have something that I want, and I want it from you, but I am precluded from using violence or fraud to acquire it, then what is my only remaining means? To persuade you to part with it by my offering you something in exchange that you come to value more highly than what I am asking you to trade to me. Therefore, each of us gives away what we value less highly to get something we value more highly. And in the interdependent system of division of labor, each of us must apply ourselves to serving our fellow man in ways that we believe will be most successful and profitable as the means of acquiring the financial wherewithal in trade that you can return yourself in the market as a consumer to buy the wares that all the others are specializing in, reciprocally to become successful income earners themselves. Now that means that you have a motive, an incentive, dare I say, in a voluntaristic society, a necessity to apply your knowledge, your experience, your innovative creativity to devise ways of making more and better things that others would be interested in taking in trade from you. And in a free and voluntary society, one in which there is competition. There is more than one cereal seller. There's more than one automobile manufacturer. And each of them now has to be offering more and better and less expensive goods, not only attract consumers to buy their product instead of some totally different commodity that's being offered, but against rivals in their own market who are saying, well, my automobile is better. I have improved features. I can offer it to you at a lower price. And the same thing with clothes, with breakfast cereal, with flat screen TVs. You harness not just self-interest, but the creativity of the human mind to assist in the improvement of mankind as a whole as the inescapable method by which you enhance your own life's betterment.
All right. On that excellent note, we're out of time. Greatly enjoyed the conversation with you, Richard, as always, and look forward to continuing it next week.
Until next time, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. Again, if this is your first exposure to the Future of Freedom Foundation, come and visit us at fff.org, and we'll look forward to talking to y'all next week.